One of the most common questions I get all the time is, do I need to know how to code if I want a cloud computing job? Now, this is one of the most polarizing, contentious questions that divides a lot of people because there are a lot of varying opinions. Today, I'm going to insert myself right in the middle of the crossfire, and I'm going to tell you based on my experience, my skills, and how I navigated the industry. And I'm also going to talk about people that I've worked with over the years and their skill sets and what I have observed and how they navigated the industry based on their backgrounds. But before we dive in, I really want to focus on terminology. Now, let's look at some common words that get tossed around, kind of like as synonyms. We have coding, we have programmer, we have software engineer, and we have software developer, just to name a few. Now, when I think of coding, I don't think of coding as a full-fledged software engineer. Because when somebody asks me, hey, I want to get into cloud computing, do I need to know how to code? It's not the same thing as I want to be a software engineer. Do I need to know how to code? So the way I'm going to answer this question is when we talk about do you need to know how to code, it's not going to be in the same vein as do I need to know how to code to be a software engineer? We're going to break them separately. So obviously, if you want to be a software engineer, like in the discussion, like you need to code. So I'm going to talk about coding in the context of the cloud computing industry. Now, I'll start here. Let's say you're coming from an infrastructure background. That's the first area I'll start with. Now, I can relate to this very well because I come from an infrastructure background. I worked with infrastructure probably around between, I would say, a 10 to 15 year period, whether I was supporting some sort of infrastructure or applications hosted in data centers at a help desk or doing desktop support. Later, I would migrate on to network administrator and sysadmin and network engineering roles. If you're coming from that infrastructure background where you're racking and stacking servers and you dealt with a lot of databases and network and storage and compute, that type of stuff, let's talk about coding in that sense. Now, back in the day, people wouldn't say, talk about coding. You would see in the job descriptions, the ability to write scripts, like scripts to do this or bash scripting or shell scripting and these types of things. It wasn't necessarily, you need to know C++ or you need to know Java. Coming from an infrastructure background, it was always incredibly helpful if you knew how to write scripts, particularly if you were standing up infrastructure or you wanted to automate some sort of installation process. The ability to write a script was very helpful. Now, some would argue that writing a script and coding are two different things, but I would like to advocate that they use similar skills. Although they're not a direct parallel, you're still using some of the same mind muscle to get these things done. But again, you're not a full-fledged software engineer. Now, let's look at the second background, developer. Now, if you already have the experience being a developer, that's going to help you because guess what? You already know how to code. But on the flip side, for developers, where I see developers kind of have the challenge is sometimes they don't necessarily have the deep infrastructure background that somebody that came from the infrastructure background would have. Why does that matter? Because you need to know about infrastructure, because if you are a developer and you're writing programs and code and software and applications, you need to know how the infrastructure is going to support it. Is the application you're writing, is it memory bound? Is it CPU bound? Does it have high I/O throughput? These are things that are going to place a demand on the infrastructure, and you need to have that background in order to optimize the software or the code that you're writing. Now, what if you didn't have an infrastructure background or developer background? How would you break into the cloud? These are folks that when they finished school, they had no formal background with infrastructure or a developer, their first job could potentially be in the cloud. I call these jobs born in the cloud jobs, in the sense that as soon as you finished your training or your schooling, you jumped headfirst into cloud computing. If you're born into the cloud, you're going to have to learn a bunch of stuff. You're going to have to learn about infrastructure. You're going to have to learn about coding and development in order to build those cloud native applications and services. Now, if you're still here with me, stick around, because now I'm about to tie everything together. So I'll start off with talking about where is coding helpful? How's that going to help you? So in the cloud, everything is API driven. So there's no physical servers or any devices that you're ever going to touch. So if you want to invoke any type of service, there's an API in front of that. Instead of going into a management console or a graphic user interface, it's very helpful to be able to interact from the command line or use an SDK, otherwise known as a software development kit, to be able to write some application or some level of code to perform a certain function. Some of the things that I think where coding is helpful are things like creating CloudFormation templates in AWS, or infrastructure code offerings like Terraform, for example, to templatize your infrastructure as code. Knowing how to code is also very helpful in DevOps roles, site reliability engineer roles. Even from a solution architect perspective, which is the role that I do, coding is beneficial, especially if you want to do a proof of concept for a customer. Your ability to code could help you greatly there. Not only that, if you know how to code, you might have roles where you don't actually need to write code as a part of your day-to-day. However, guess what? If you have a role such as a solution architect, you're going to be talking to development teams a bunch. And the fact that you have written code yourself, or you understand the software development lifecycle process, or you understand agile practices in coding, this is going to help you be able to recommend the right services for those development teams. Now, if you're already a developer jumping into the cloud, you already know how to code a bunch. This is going to give you a great advantage because you're going to be able to really adopt the things that I mentioned earlier for those that need to figure out how to code. You're going to know how to script. You're going to know how to do more automation, more DevOps, and deploy applications in the cloud. So you're going to have a lot of opportunities there as well. Now, just talking a little bit more about my experience, I came from a very heavy infrastructure background, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the areas of development that I proactively focused on was to learn more about development, prioritize my learning of application and development tools within AWS, so that when I was having conversations with my customers, I could be more effective. Now, for folks I've worked with over the years where they were developers in other areas of their career before jumping into cloud, I've seen the former developers do really great things as well. They're really good at doing proof of concepts, and the conversations that they have with the dev teams, they can go very deep, which is very good at earning trust with the customer. And now for my final thoughts. Coding. It really depends on what your goals are. If you want it to be a software engineer that deploys your applications and services in the cloud, then 100% you're going to need to know how to code. Program, software development, software engineer, whatever you want to call it. There's no way around it. But I would say in this day and age, even if you don't aspire to be a software engineer, you want to be a cloud architect or a cloud engineer or a solution architect, knowing how to code to some degree. Again, I'm not saying go full on crazy and, you don't have to go to software engineering track, but knowing how to code to some degree, potentially knowing how to read code and understand it, or at the very least being able to templatize infrastructure and being able to have conversations with the dev teams that are aligned to application development best practices is going to be necessary. Now, I don't want you to feel discouraged. Again, you don't have to be a full-on software engineer if you want to be a cloud architect, a site reliability engineer, or a cloud engineer, or solution architect, or what have you. But you can take any gaps you have and go seek training so you can gain the necessary skills so you can be more effective in the role you choose in the cloud. The one other thing I wanted to leave you with, one final thought, is I want you to take a look at what's called no-code and low-code tools. We are in an exciting space right now with generative AI, and even those that could not formally code can now provide prompts to generative AI platforms that return code snippets, applications that do a variety of different things. So I think we're at a point now where even if you don't know how to code, you're going to have some great advantages leveraging AI. And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I encourage you to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.